Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.
Welcome back, everybody, to ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, and I'm here with Augusto Pinaud, Francis Wade, and Art Gelwicks. Welcome to ProductivityCast, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
Hey, how you doing?
Good morning, everybody.
We're going to be talking about today the idea of the external brain, and I just wanted to disclaim this for anyone who might be listening to us. I know a couple of our listeners are medical doctors, and so for those of you who are medical professionals, please know that we are not talking about the assistive devices and so forth that are called external brains. We're talking about the productivity-focused concept of the external brain. But what we're going to do today in this episode is really define what an external brain is. We're then going to talk about why it's important in at least personal productivity for you to have an external brain once we are all sort of on the same page in terms of what it is. And then we're going to talk about how each of us potentially uses the functions of building an external brain. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Art, to start sort of the co-defining process of how do you define what an external brain is?
All right. We've talked about this in previous episodes, this idea of spheres of access and where information is related to you and how do you get to it. And to me, this idea of an external brain, the information that is relevant to you but does not need to be immediately accessible or at your fingertips, falls into that category. Because it's not information that I need to keep in my head. It's not information I need to have on a Post-it note on the monitor in front of me. But it's information that I'm going to encounter during my day that I may need again in the future. It feels like it's relevant, it has interest and value to me, but I need to put it someplace where I can go get it later. And when I think about this model, I have to think that this is almost one of the most challenging areas that we have when we think about productivity, because this stuff is probably the biggest candidate of productive clutter that I can imagine. Just thinking about this as we brought this topic up, I went digging back through a lot of my external systems, looking at things like Pocket, for example, which I use for offline reading, Instapaper and Feedly, and starting to dig through OneNote. And I'm thinking more about it, just the plethora of things that I have that every time I look at them, I go, yeah, that's interesting, that's relevant, I want to keep that. And then literally 10 minutes later, I have no idea that that's even in the system. So I'm curious, one, how we all handle this idea of important but not critical stuff. How do we organize it? And really probably the biggest thing, how do we keep it from becoming overwhelming?
I'll say that for me, the idea of the external brain was first introduced to me through really discussions of Getting Things Done by David Allen, and the idea of your brain is for having ideas, not holding them, as David is often quoted as saying. And this always led me to the Einsteinian concept, right? That colloquially or sort of mythically, Einstein never remembered the phone numbers of any of the people he knew. And he would always say, I don't need that information because it's in the phone book. And that really did clue me into something very important, which was that, yeah, we have these tools that are available to us, like an address book or a contact database, a piece of software where we can put all of this information so that it didn't have to be rolling around in my head, taking up space that was unnecessary. I've always had the conflict between the external brain and our real brain, in the sense that my concern is that when I need something to be in my foremind, at a particular time and location, I want to be able to resurrect that information very, very quickly. I want to be able to not only retain it, but be able to recall it very, very quickly when necessary. So there's actually a toggling back and forth between what information do we commit to, long-term memory, and what information do we commit to the external brain, this long-term external memory storage tool or device or devices, in order to be able to be effective in real time.
I'm not happy with my external brain. I use a lot of Evernote as my tool, and of course the hard drive on my laptop. I am not happy in the sense that it's not adequately indexed. It's not properly tagged. It's sort of a real hodgepodge of stuff that's just basically thrown together. This is when it comes to sort of the data that I know that I may need at some point in the future. So that I can't find with a quick Google search. So I only really save the stuff following Einstein's precept that I can't find very quickly with a Google search. So stuff that would be too hard to find or kind of ambiguous, that's the stuff I really save. I'm not altogether happy with the method of storage or retrieval. I like the fact that Evernote and other kinds of tools like that are there and that they work very well. But I think there's something missing in my practice in terms of how I put something away and then how I pull it back out. So I'm sort of in this one as a student looking to improve the way I do things.
Yeah, my battle point really when I think about it is in two main categories I've got things that I've read and things that I've gathered, for lack of a better term. So if I think about the things that I've gathered, they're actually a little bit easier because everything like that goes into OneNote. I generate notes, I take pictures, I tag things, everything goes in there. That becomes a trusted system equation. As long as I am consistent in my behavior of putting things into that system, I know I will be able to get them back out should I remember that I need them. Now, it doesn't change the fact that I wind up accumulating a lot of stuff in it that I probably don't need, and every so often you need to do a digital decluttering, which I find amusing that some people say, oh, no, there's no reason. We have mass storage, just keep everything. I think we've even had this discussion. I'll never buy into that because I'll go in there and I'll look and I'll say, why the heck do I still have that? And coming from the old school computer world where bytes were expensive, I still will go through and actually delete things rather than just keep them and store them. But the big challenge for me is the things that I read, because I try to make as much of an effort as possible to read as many different sources as I can. But I can't keep all of that in my head. It just, for various reasons, age being one of them. So I have to say, how am I going to reference this information? And that's where I struggle, because I'm looking at different sources of the reading content. If it's in Kindle, for example, you can highlight things. Great. If it's in Pocket, you can highlight and put notes in. If it's in Instapaper, you can highlight and put notes. But they're all disparate systems. So I have yet to find one that I can consistently use all the time for everything to make it the trusted system. So now I wind up with information in various boxes with various sorts of tags and highlights. I don't necessarily feel like I can go back and say, we started talking about this idea of mindfulness, for example, in a conversation, and I know there was an article I was reading about it, and I want to be able to reference that article to someone. I don't remember what system I was in when I saw the article. I know the article's there. I know the content's there. I should be able to find it, but where do I start? That's where I run into the challenge with this.
And I would add a sort of potential solution is a meta search tool, right? And there are several of them actually on the market today that searches against the various different software that you have. In this case, cloud storage tools, where you can basically search multiple silos of data. And I think that's really where the future is going to go. I was actually testing, and I'm not going to mention the product because it has recently shut down, but I had been testing a product that I thought was going to be very, very useful. And what it actually did was it scanned images of your computer screen, and presumably they would go to the effect of taking screenshots of your mobile phone screen, and then it took that information, and over time it indexed the pages and the information that was showing on screen. So you started to get this visual index of everything that you looked at. And that way, when you searched back against it, you kind of saw this sort of interesting visual matrix of context. So you were able to see literally what you searched when you searched for it. And it was actually really interesting. Unfortunately, the company has now shut down, and so we're going to have to look to new things.
There was a product out for a long time. I think they're still out, and it's a web-based product. Actually, it has an install. It's called The Brain, of all things. And they had a personal version and a professional version, and it dealt with informational linking. So instead of creating hierarchical structures and things like Evernote and OneNote, it was literally, I have this article and it's about these topics, so I'm going to link it to these other topic or other items that have the same topic and be able to work almost, I don't want to use the term neural network, but almost through that kind of logical branching and relationship connection. I played with it for about a year and a half, really a fascinating tool, but you had to be so bought into that structural connection that it almost became a project in and of itself. There's another great product out there for this kind of organization and tying pieces together called Workflowy, which is an outline-based structure. It's really nice because you can drop links into different things. So I could see almost creating an index model there. I'm going down a slightly different path. I just completed a lesson for a OneNote training that's going on. And I'm trying to build out my own digital assistant for this part of the equation. So what I'm doing is I'm using IFTTT, one of my favorite applications on the web, if this then that, to say that when I mark something in one of my readers, to go ahead and put a note in OneNote with the context of what I just marked so that I can leverage the searching capabilities and also have a link back to the original content. I'm trying to build that assistant in a way that works with the way I function rather than changing the way I function to work with those. And I have to do that because I found this is one of my failing areas for this type of a system. If I don't work with my natural instincts, I won't use it. 90% of the time, I will adjust my natural instincts to work with an optimal process. Not a problem. But for some reason, I've got a blind spot around this particular piece that I have to say, okay, if I read it, what am I going to do with it, and how am I going to pull it back?
Yeah, so the tool that I was talking about was something called OTIXO that I use for cloud-based storage search. So I can search against Evernote, I can search against my Google Drive, and in my case I have a personal Google Drive and then a Google Drive through G Suite, my company-based accounts, and several others, Dropbox and Box and so on and so forth. So if you keep several different cloud storage containers, you can search against all of those. The big problem then is that if you have data sitting on your local computers, the way that I've solved that is that the new sort of Google Drive is now being sort of consumed by the new branding, which will be Google Backup and Sync. So Google, many people have been hearing about this idea, and by the time this is actually published, you all will have heard about the fact that Google Drive has somehow gone away. It hasn't gone away. Google Drive has just been rewritten under a new name. All of the same functions are there, plus more. And one of those plus more tools under Google Backup and Sync is the ability to take local Drive documents, say I have a My Documents folder or Documents folder on the Mac. Well, you can take those and add them as selective sync folders up to Google Drive. So instead of taking your Google Drive documents and bringing them down to your local desktop, you can also backup, in essence. It's not really backup, it's really redundancy and synchronization. But the point is that now I have all of that information in Google Drive also for indexing. So I know what's on my local drives based on the synchronization of those folders locally. So it's actually very, very helpful for me to go to OTIXO. It's OTIXO.com. I have no idea how to pronounce that, so I'm not even going to try. But you just go there, you type in a search, and it's not perfect, but now it is giving me a search against all of my systems as opposed to each silo at a time.
It's interesting because this starts to branch into this whole conversation around, and it's an information architecture one, between structure and search. Creation of hierarchical mapping and tags versus free-form search capabilities. And I think with an external brain concept, I think you're driven more into the open search structure. Just because you would spend so much time trying to create a comprehensive architecture for this, I don't know that it would necessarily benefit at a certain point. Now, you would have to have a basic architecture, but you're talking about like with Google Drive, and I'm thinking about the same thing on OneDrive. That search capability, as long as you have some reference that the thing that you're looking for went in there, then you can pull it back. But there's a trust as well. I think if you're going to go down that path for an external brain, the best investment you can make in your time is learning that search architecture, that whatever that tool is that uses, inside out and sideways. I mean, I know Evernote, for example, has a crazy powerful search capability, if I remember correctly. And OneNote's search capability doesn't have the same type of structures you can put in, but it's very smart about how it reads content, reads images, and pulls information back as search context. I think the same thing's probably applicable to OneDrive and to Google Drive. So if you spend time thinking about that and making sure that if I go in there, it's going to be able to be indexed and I'm going to be able to pull it back, then I think you can start to build this stuff out. It still doesn't solve this problem I have, though, with the writing, or the reading rather, going through and saying, I've got this 18-page web article that was really cool, but there was a paragraph in it that I cared about. I didn't care about the rest of it. I have to find a way to get that nugget out with the connection.
Yeah, that almost comes to the idea of sort of a fluid markup, right? Where you're able to sort of highlight a paragraph and identify that with some level of markup, not even visual markup, but just some kind of markup that identifies that it's important to your, important to your world in some way, shape, or form in the future.
I wanted to add to a comment you made about using cloud drives. I've started to use them myself. Once again, back to my sort of challenge is that they're poorly indexed. They're not. I'd say they're not indexed at all. But I have saved a lot of space on my hard drive, which has resulted in my computer running quite a bit faster by putting iTunes up in the cloud. So I used Google Drive, and I'm using that capability you mentioned where you could store certain files on Google Drive but not on your own hard drive. So I'm able to save my iTunes to the cloud but not have it saved locally. And it understands that, okay, like when I'm saving iTunes files, I'll save it straight to the cloud. So that's a huge saving for me, and I paid I think $2 or $3 a month in order to get the extra 100 gig of Google Drive space. But that's one win. But the overall sort of the picture is still one of a mess where I have Google Drive, I have Amazon Drive, I have Microsoft's version, which I use very, very rarely. I use Dropbox. So I'm using all of these different drives, but all these external drives, and great external brain. I can even access some of them, most of them from my smartphone. But what's the structure? It's real hodgepodge. I can't say that I have like an architecture. I have more of a hit or miss situation, which leads to the problems that Art mentioned. It's that sometimes, and this is now happening, I remember, just like he said, a paragraph from an article which is saved somewhere. It could be in Evernote, it could be in Dropbox, it could be on OneDrive, it could be in one of these many places. And for me I have to actually remember, where did I save it, under what context, in which context, what was the circumstance, what was the logic I used at the moment. Did I think it would fit into this folder, or it would fit into this topic, or it would fit? So I'm now left with a plethora of sort of splintered choices, and when I look at the overall landscape, they don't make any sense. So I'm wasting all the time, as you could imagine, doing searches or even deciding where to save something. There's a pause where I say to myself, am I going to save this in a place where I can find it? I sort of say, well, under what circumstances might I need it in the future? Okay, then what keywords would I use then? And where would I look for those to use those keywords? And the whole thing is just it's just like I said, a hodgepodge. And I wish there were some defining rules that I could apply, some useful set of some guidelines. I would love that.
I think that's one of the areas that we have to look at. The more I've been thinking about this, I realize that you're hitting right on the challenge point of this entire equation. It's not that the technology can't do this for us. It's the fact that there are almost too many options. There's so many ways to approach this particular challenge that we look at it and go, okay, I could put it here, I could put it here, None of them is a 100% solution, which is realistic. We'll never hit a 100% solution on any of these. However, in many of the cases, I'm thinking that, you know what, maybe there is a consistent behavior. And I go back to an experiment I did on myself a while ago where I tried to say, okay, could I use OneDrive, or in this case I was using Google Drive, could I use Google Drive to reproduce everything I was doing in OneNote? Could I use it not only to store the images that I'm using, but could I also use it to store file attachments? Well, those two, natural functionality. But how do I handle notes? Could I use it to take notes? Could I use it? And that's when I had to start to say, okay, does this make sense? Yes. Technically, I could do it. I could create docs. I could store everything in the docs themselves, create the pages in the architecture. I could reproduce it. Then Google Drive would be my single system. But again, it didn't solve every problem. And just thinking about what we were talking about here, I was playing around. My reader of choice when it comes to stuff off the web is a tool called Instapaper. I used to use Pocket quite a bit. Love Pocket, great tool. Instapaper has a nice feature though where it will strip down and clean up any web page. So it's just the textual content, which makes it wonderful on a mobile device. But when I mentioned earlier, learning the tools, I just poked around inside Instapaper and I found an option that allows me to search the notes and the highlights I took. So I literally, sitting here now, just solved that particular problem I had. It has a folder architecture that I can leverage, and it has the ability to go through and store and archive content. So great functionality. This is an opportunity for me to go down further down that path. Am I likely to run into another problem? Yeah, it's going to happen. Pretty much guaranteed. But I'm not going to let that dissuade me from what appears to be a good procedural step for me moving forward. So I don't think, unfortunately, there is a defined architecture. There is no clear best practice for this mess. My suggestion would be create a flowchart for yourself. Say, okay, this thing comes into my flow. What am I likely to do with it? And then how am I going to likely access that information? There's an acronym I use all the time to help people understand the procedure. It's CPR on all your information. It's capture, process, report. You've got to be able to get it in, you've got to be able to manipulate it, and you've got to be able to pull it back out at some point. Well, if you look at all your information that's coming through, you should be able to define a process for yourself. It may not be consistent destinations, but you should be able to define a process for yourself that you can follow for the different types of information. And then when you go back to look for it, you know, okay, that type of thing would have gone through this little Plinko chart and wound up here, so that's where I'm going to go look.
So the importance of the external brain comes, the reality is your brain is a tool for think, to make decisions, to move forward, not to storage information. And we tend to use it a lot more than what we should for storage. What this external brain allows you is to really have the place where everything can be retrieved. When I remember, I think the first time I have a pseudo external brain was with a Casio. My first PDA, this will date me, was a Casio. You flip it, and then it had a little keyboard stuff, and it was I don't remember even how it's called, but I start creating notes. And I've been migrating those notes from the Casio to the Palm Pilot, to the different versions of Palm Pilots, to the iPhone. So, but the cool thing is, I can look into, and now that our searchable are even better, because I can search for data that I know my brain don't need to remember at all. And that's what we want for this external brain. That allows me to, or allowed my brain not to try to hold of information, because my brain knows that it's really on their fingertips. And that allows me to use my brain for what I think is his primary role, that is make decisions and think in a much more effective way than when I try to keep everything holding on my brain because I cannot or I should not. And I understand it's bad on the sense that I don't even know a phone number anymore. I remember when I was a kid, you knew, I don't know, 10 to 15, your grandparents, your uncles, and your friends. And I don't know a phone anymore. I don't know a lot of information because it's all in the external brain, all in the technology and the different places. And like that, a ton of information. But I think that also allow me to move forward and use my brain in better ways.
Thank you, Augusto. I think that's really helpful to contextualize, why the external brain is important. And now we're going to, again, fast forward to some of the travails in building and developing out an external brain system that works for you. And so I'm gonna start off with potentially trying to answer some of Art and Francis's questions as it relates and challenges as it relates to this. So let me start here with just sort of a fleshing out of what I do, and in terms of addressing it, and then the particulars we can talk about as well. So I always think that a hybrid of some kind of structure and then understanding how to search, going back to Art's earlier thoughts on this matter, you need both. I really sincerely don't believe that you can always find everything through search, and to some extent you don't need to. So therefore, there is a way in which you can create a hybrid of that system. I do that through creating what I call life categories. And you can call this whatever you want, but you, in essence, have to take your world and split it up into chunks, into pieces of a pie, if you want to think about it as slices of a pie. But in essence, you need to create some hierarchy of a folder structure or buckets of some kind. In Evernote, there are stacks and notebooks. In OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, and otherwise, they're going to be folders. But I think as few folders as possible that help contain the areas of your life. I'll give you some example. You might have a folder called personal finances, a folder called legal, a folder called health, a folder called personal, a folder called family, whatever they might be. And you're going to list those categories, and those become the structure across all of your systems, right? So you might have those same folders become separate calendars in your calendar system. So all your family events go on one calendar. All of your work events go on your professional calendar. All of your meetings with your financial advisor or with your tax accountant or otherwise would go on your finances calendar. And in essence, a calendar allows you to see them all overlaid on top of one another, but now they're going to be color-coded. You can play with that data in a contextualized fashion. You can create those same notebooks and stacks in Evernote. You can create those same labels or folders in your Gmail or Outlook, right? Across the board now, you have an overarching infrastructure that allows you to file, that is, move things out of your inboxes and then into the infrastructure very easily and naturally. Because if they are all primarily the same, then you're not thinking so much about where things have to go once you get comfortable and it becomes habitual for you to move those things. Then search takes over. At that point, then you need to think about naming conventions, tags, and other mechanisms, other kinds of markup or metadata that allows you to be able to search against that data. But I think those big, broad buckets help you to be able to say, okay, well, I'm looking for something for medical. Well, let me click on the medical label in Gmail or look in the medical notebook in Evernote. And now the search is very much more defined. So that if you look for receipts, right, you tag something as receipts, you're only looking in medical because you're looking for medical receipts. You're not looking for receipts that you paid for a recent family vacation, right? These things become much more natural and fluid for you. And I think there's a structure there, an infrastructure there that with a little bit of modification, it becomes very, very useful for you as an individual in being able to blend both hierarchical structure, broad-based hierarchical structure, and search.
That goes, though, to the key of understanding how your system, the tool itself, works, because you have to make sure that the tool supports that kind of narrowed search capability, and you know how to get into that functionality.
Absolutely.
Actually, I had a question of Art. He mentioned CPR before, Capture Process Report, and I wondered if he could tell us a little bit about the subtasks that are under each of those headings.
Sure. The idea for Capture Process Report is when you think about the first step and the capture piece, that's origin of the content itself that's going to go into your system. The trigger that indicates it's an actionable piece of information, and basically the compression. How do you squeeze it into your system? So if you think about the origin of the item, you have all the disparate pieces. You may have written text, you may have online text, web pages, feed readers, you name it. The action part, or the trigger part, is what in that sets the flag in your brain, either immediately or procedurally, that that's something that you need to retain, that you've got to include in your system. And it doesn't push it from the second sphere of influence, which is important and accessible, out to globally searchable or generally searchable. Something that you could probably go back and search in Google for and find again if you needed to, with just the vague recollection that you had seen it at some point. So really, the C has three main steps. If we think about the P, and if I continue to use the CPR analogy with that, if you think about at that point you've completed the compression for CPR compression, blood is circulating, air is circulating. So the process is, how does that piece of information that you've now grabbed move through your system? Is it one clear cycle where it's going through just from point A to point B, maybe going straight from whatever you've captured it to right into Evernote? Or does it have to go through multiple steps? Does it, in my case, it's going from a feed reader to Instapaper, where I'm then going to go through and review it and mark it up? What happens to it then? What's the cycle of it? And what's its life cycle within that? So P is not really individual steps. It's more of defining that life cycle. The challenge with P is that it can be multiple parallel paths depending on what's moving through it. So you may have a different process execution for reading material versus maybe a brochure for something that you're looking into purchasing. Different exercise, different purpose for that content. So instead of it being blood, it may be air. You want to follow those analogies. Finally, the report part. How are you going to pull it back, and what are you going to do with that information when you pull it back? So if you're going to pull something back for your own use, where are you going to do it? Is it going to be mobile? Is it going to be desktop? How do you want to be able to consume that again? Is it you just want the text, or you want it to look like you originally saw it? And third, is it just you that's going to use that information? Or do you need to be able to pull that information back and then share it with someone else? Well, if you're going to have the sharing part, the extended reporting, that's a whole different conversation, because now you've got to think about, well, how am I going to get this information out of my system? So I use the CPR analogy because I think if you break it down to those types of steps, you can really wrap a process around this intangible stuff that you have coming in and how you're going to manipulate it at a high level. I'm in the process of writing an article right now, but I'll detail it out in more detail around how CPR truly works, at least from my perspective, when it comes to this kind of information life cycle.
I think the immediate value to me is it's a way to weed out the next drive or the next storage software or the next external brain possibility that gets offered to me. Because chances are by the end of the week, there's going to be something that's going to catch my eye. I'm going to say, ooh, nice, bright, shiny object. Ooh, free storage. Ooh. And I'll go sign up for it with absolutely no plan in mind as to how it fits into anything else or what I'm going to use it for. But I'll just use it. I'll sign up for it because, hey, it's free. But there's a cost to doing that.
It doesn't have to exclude new systems. Because if you think, if I parallel it to something that a lot of us do anymore, health tracking, and you have your fitness tracker, your Fitbit or your Gear Pro or whatever you have, that's an information stream coming to you that has to be captured, processed, and reported on for it to be useful. However, that may not be going into Google Drive. It may not be going into OneNote. It may be going into a dedicated application that has a specific function to provide that information back. However, there is no way I can tell you what my average pulse rate was 3 weeks ago, but I may want to know that at some point. So if we look at this external brain process, I can define for this type of information, this is where it's going to go and this is how I'm going to call it. But I have to go through the effort of mapping that for myself so that later on when I say, hey, I have this type of information, what do I do with it? I can look at my map and say, oh, okay, that's where it's supposed to go, and be able to put it there in a consistent behavior. I think that's, the more I ponder this, that's where people get off the rails, because they don't create a map for themselves as to what their external brain should be. They don't give a little diagram of their neurons in their external brain. Something comes in, it's got to move through, it's got to come out. And it should be consistent. If I have to think about what that route is every time, I've just made it more complex for myself, not easier.
Hence the need for a flowchart.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Or a mind map. Hey, if you're a mind mapper, and I love mind mapping, I think it's a fantastic tool. Mind mapping is a great way to approach this because it eliminates a lot of the core structure needed with a flowchart, but it still gives you all those little boxes as to how something's going to move A to B to C to D.
So I did want, in the time that we have left, for our listeners to get a little bit of a framework in terms of if you're new to the external brain concept, and you likely are new to the concept, though you have been utilizing it in some way, shape, or form in your life already. That is, you probably have a contacts app, right, on your phone or on your computer or otherwise. Maybe you have a paper-based address book, as my mom does. My mom keeps still a thorough, well-annotated address book with every birthday and address and phone number with updates and so on and so forth. She's her own little computer. And the idea, though, is that you take that area of your world and see how you're fundamentally succeeding and or are falling, tripping up, stumbling in that process, and try to shore it up. Try to figure out what are the missing elements. Just take that moment of reflection and review, and then plan out a new way in which you're going to address it. There are some basic fundamentals. I used to tutor reading for elementary school students, and we always talked about reading as decoding, right? Understanding the parts of a word or those kinds of things. Basically, as you're taking information in, how are you breaking it into chunks that are relatable? So what are the natural chunks that things are broken up into? And that's where, in my sort of methodology, you create that hierarchy. What's the hierarchy of things in your world? Then it's comprehension. Do I understand the information that's happening in my world? So we rely on decoding to comprehend, right? Because we need to break things apart, and then we need to understand those individual components as well. Then comes to retention. Where am I going to put those chunks in order to be able to most appropriately access them at the right place and time, right? So that nexus of those 3 points, I need or want it, right? So need or want, and then place and time. Where am I, and at what times in my day, week, month, year do I need that information, or a specific date and time? Then there's recall on the other side of that. So at the point in which I need it at a place and time, how do I bring that information out so that it's relevant to me? So you have a couple of components that you need to really deal with when it comes to building an external brain, and in almost every one of those categories of your life. As Art said at the top, there are things that he might put into OneDrive or Google Drive or otherwise that he wouldn't put into OneNote, and vice versa, because they satisfy different functions. They have different features. And I think we all have to take that into account as we're developing and building out our external brains.
You bring an interesting comment, and I hope my mother do not listen to this show. Because it's important to remember that external brain, even if you share the information or not, it's meant to work for you. My mother, probably as yours, Ray, has her own documentation, but it's really, nobody can use it, because if you say, let me find Ray, well, a normal person, if we try to find information Ray, will try the R for Ray or the S for Sidney Smith, okay? My mother may have it on the F. And when you wonder, mother, what does on the F? Well, that's friend of Augusto. It makes total sense, okay? So that's how my mother organization works, okay? So whatever she had on that external brain of hers, okay, it's really only accessible to her and nobody else, unless you can go and think like her. But that is important. Even if you have it on the digital, don't think it need to be on a particular way or in a way that others can come and interact with this. This is designed, or should be designed and built for you. And if you need to put Art, Francis, and Ray on the F because they're friends of my kids, that's fine. If you know that your brain will be able to retrieve it there, instead of start thinking, oh, great, now I need to think what is the name of this friend of my son that I have no clue, and I think it starts with an R or an S. So building this brain external brain also have those exclusive things and unique things. So keep it. I agree. There are things that their natural place is Dropbox or Box or OneNote or Evernote, and it's okay. As far as it's built for you and for you to find that information, and you're not trying to make it so others can.
You've hit it right on the nose there. I can't help but think about the axiom that says something's not truly lost until mom can't find it. I know that's the way it works in our house because she's coordinating, for years, these three crazy little people running around the house and also her spouse, and being able to keep things organized and know where things are. And Ray, I think it's great that your mom's rocking an analog system. I think that's fantastic because that's her system and it works for her, and she's able to find what she needs and knows that it's there. But the most important part is she trusts it. She trusts her system. It's one of those things I think we could talk about in more detail when we think about system transfers. But yeah, definitely build stuff up the way you are. That's absolutely right on the target there, Augusto.
There is two things that I will consider, or there's two things I will leave or would like to leave in mind. One is consistency, and the other one is portability. Technology change, and some of that information will stay with you for a really long time. So make sure that whatever you build, that external brain, it can be portable, it can be exported, it can be taken to a different format. Because there is nothing worse than have all that fantastic brain outside, all that external brain, all configured and all that, and then the platform you were using disappearing. Or even worse, trying to get back to it 5 years later because it was on so-and-so piece of software, and now there is nothing that can open that file and is completely incompatible. So whatever that external brain is and whatever platform you decide to trust for that, make sure that you will be able to export it. If years ago, when Evernote came out, Evernote did not have a nice way to export, and was the reason I originally walked away from it until they came with a nicer way to export your notes, because I did not want it to put all the information as they were asking for or proposing that the software could do, but then not being able to take the information out, or at least not in an easy way. So pay attention to that part on the portability. Yes, you hope you are not going to change platforms, but as I was discussing last week with somebody, this person lives on an Apple ecosystem, okay, same as I do. iPhone, everything. Work just came and decided to change some of the machines, and now he got from work that he need to use, because that's where the software that they rely on is. He got an Android phone and an Android tablet. So he has two options. He can carry two devices now, or he can move everything to Android. The second option is a viable option, except that now he needs to see what of that information he can port in an easy way, and what of that information he's been having for years on the iPhone he needs to copy and paste, or even re-enter all the information. So make sure, regardless where you are, what is that portability factor for your information, for your external brain.
Great. I think that's a good place for us to close out. I want to wish everybody the foresight in terms of building an external brain, to make sure that you are really thinking about how you can develop it so that it fits into the various categories of your life, that you're capable of trusting it. And I think to Art's point about trust comes Augusto's point about consistency, right? The more you consistently put the information into the right places and appropriately tag it and all those other fun things, then the better you're going to be able to backflow and search for it, find it in the appropriate folder or notebook, and then be able to search those areas where that information might be. So with that, Here's to your productive life. This is ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, and I'm here with Augusto Pinaud, Art Gelwicks, and Francis Wade. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here today, and take care.
That's it for this Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.